Um, the US is doing more fiscal stimulus than almost any other advanced economy in the world, let alone developing economies. These charts come from the IMF's Fiscal Monitor that was published in early April. And you can see there that according to the IMF, the US will be running a budget deficit this year that's barely smaller than the deficit that they ran in 2020, of the order of 15.5% of GDP. No other economy is really coming close to that. The UK, for example, as you can see, ran a budget deficit of almost 14% of GDP. It will run one of about 12% of GDP in 2022, but afterwards it falls away fairly quickly. Even here in Australia, where our fiscal policy response has been fairly large by international standards and certainly by our own historical standards, the deficits which Australian governments are going to be running pale into insignificance by comparison with those that the United States is going to be running. And even if you look at more contemporary data, you can see that over the 12 months to March, for example, the US budget deficit, that's the federal one, not including the deficits of states, was 22.2% of GDP, which is the largest since 1943. That reflects in particular a 66% increase in government spending, including all those cash handouts over that period compared with the previous 12 months. And that's been matched by a very large increase in the total stock of US government debt outstanding. Although it's worth noting in passing that a surprisingly large proportion of that debt is actually held internally, either by US government trust funds or by the Federal Reserve. And although the Biden administration is yet to present a full budget for the fiscal year that begins on 1 October this year, they call that fiscal 2022, they have already proposed a 16% increase in non-defense, non-discretionary spending. Some of that, the US administration is seeking to cover by increases in the corporate tax rate from 19% to 25%. That's about halfway from, sorry, I should say from 19% to 28%. That is halfway between where it was when the Trump administration cut it, when the Trump administration came to office, and where the Trump administration cut it to in its 2017 tax cuts. The administration is also proposing some increases in the top marginal tax rate for personal taxpayers to 39.6% from the present 36%. And they're also looking to impose higher rates of tax on capital gains accruing to people earning over $1 million a year. It remains to be seen, of course, whether all of those measures will pass Congress, because not all of them are supported by all Democrats. The Biden administration's proposals have prompted a lively debate over whether they're doing too much by way of fiscal stimulus relative to the problem they're seeking to solve. For example, Larry Summers, who was Treasury Secretary in the Clinton administration and also an advisor to the Obama administration in its first term, has argued that the US fiscal package is 3 times as big as the output gap, that's the difference between actual and potential GDP, that it's seeking to address, in contrast to the Obama administration's fiscal measures, which according to Larry Summers amounted to about half the size of the output gap that the US was confronting in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And Summers argues that in combination with the large amount of savings that households have accrued over the past 12 months and the looser monetary policy settings that the Fed now has in place, the result is likely to be a significant increase in the US inflation rate, which in turn could have consequences for the US dollar. Summers has also been critical in passing of some of the quality of the proposed US government fiscal response, saying that there's not enough worthwhile public investment in things like infrastructure, and there's too much of cash handouts to households and other relatively low-grade spending. Summers's position has been backed by a range of other economists, including, for example, Olivia Blanchard, who was chief economist of the IMF, and by Maurice Obstfeld, who's been chief economist of the OECD. On the other hand, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, who was formerly chairman of the Fed, has said that the administration's measures are necessary to get unemployment down to where the administration and the Fed wants to get it. And she says, as does the current Fed chair, Jay Powell, that if inflation does become a problem, then they've got the tools to deal with it, by which they presumably mean that the Fed can always put interest rates up. Yeah, whereas by contrast, given where interest rates are at the moment, they can't really afford, they haven't got the scope to bring them down. So how likely it is it that there will be an increase in inflation